Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Corporate Law and Financial Regulation Program of the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. My name's Elizabeth Boris, and tonight we're hearing from Professor Dan Puchniak. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. For those attending in person, we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. First Peoples have upheld their laws on these lands for generations, and I pay respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other custodians. As I said a moment ago, our speaker tonight is Professor Dan Puchniak. The short biographical information I'm about to give you doesn't do justice to his very impressive CV, but we wouldn't have a seminar if I read it all out. The short version is Professor Puchniak is the Yong Pung Hau Professor at the Yong Pung Hau School of Law at Singapore Management University. He's also the Director of their Centre for Commercial Law in Asia, a research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and the co-editor-in-chief of the Cambridge Forum on Corporate Climate Governance. He's an internationally recognised scholar in the field of comparative corporate law and governance with a focus on Asia, has held visiting academic positions at leading law schools around the world and received numerous domestic and international awards for his academic research and teaching. His pioneering research has been in the emerging field of intra-Asian comparative corporate law and governance. Melbourne Law School is particularly fortunate that Professor Puchniak is here in Melbourne to teach a subject in our Melbourne Law Masters on comparative corporate law in Asia, starting tomorrow, I believe. But tonight he's presenting on his co-authored paper entitled The Overlooked Reality of Shareholder Activism in China, Defying Western Expectations. So without more, I'll hand over to Professor Puchniak.
Well, thank you very much. With an introduction like that, I'm only sure to fail in this talk, but it is absolutely wonderful to be back at Melbourne Law School. I think it was about 13 years ago when I was actually here last. I had come many times around that period, but it's been quite some time since I've been back. And my memories of the last time I taught here were wonderful. Yeah. And I also want to thank Elizabeth for chairing and Rosemary Langford for organizing this event. One thing I think Melbourne Law School has earned a reputation for is its research in Asian legal studies. So before I'm at Singapore Management University, now at the Yong Pung Hau School of Law. Before that, for 14 years, I was at NUS directing the Center for Asian Legal Studies. And when we'd sit around and think about law schools in the world that did Asian law very well, Melbourne was always very high up on the list, if not at the top of the list. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I have to start out by really thanking my co-authors. And Elizabeth asked me a question that made me feel a bit sad inside. When I got into the room, she said, "Do you speak Mandarin?" And I said, "My son speaks Mandarin," which is the truth because he was born in Singapore, but I don't. And I have been focusing on Asian corporate law for almost 2 decades. And I avoided writing about China, to be very honest. I thought there's enough people with great linguistic skills who are doing it. And it's just become, frankly, unavoidable. And I found 2 wonderful co-authors who really, of course, now that you know I don't speak Mandarin, you realize that there had to be some smart people in the room for this paper to take shape. And Zhou Chan at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou is absolutely incredible scholar, and she worked with a team of students on this paper, pulling together the data for it. And Zhang Wei, who is my dear friend and colleague at Singapore Management University, he's on my faculty. And Wei is really sort of the mouthpiece for explaining, especially US corporate law in Chinese. but is also really gifted, much more than I am, with empirical legal studies, which you will see if you read the paper, played a very significant role in how this paper was framed. So the paper is entitled "The Overlooked Reality of Shareholder Activism in China, Defying Western Expectations." And I'm going to start with something a little bit strange. Yeah, this is my attempt to take a screenshot after, for those of you who actually run, it will be a very slow time, you'll see. But for my morning jog in Hangzhou in May. And why do I start here? I have a nicer picture, which is a picture I actually took when I was doing more sightseeing than running. And it's just a reminder that Hangzhou, for those of you, how many people have been in this room? One. Okay, for those of you who haven't, it's an absolutely beautiful city. It used to be known for its West Lake. So this is the West Lake. Now it's known for its high-tech firms. So people will say it's the Silicon Valley of China. And if you were to gaze away from the lake this way, you would see a massive skyline that has risen above the West Lake. And why it's probably most famous these days is this is the birthplace of DeepSeek. And you'll all recall that DeepSeek was the Chinese AI model that shocked the West when it was seen to produce an LLM that was far more efficient than ChatGPT, but had relatively similar types of results. But why I start here is because I gave two presentations. I presented this exact paper, in fact, in China. And I wanted to just play a bit of a thought experiment. Elizabeth already passed the test. Yeah. So she passed the test, but hopefully the rest of you can engage in this thought experiment with me before I go through the paper. So an interesting fact that I brought up, so I've been fortunate to have been able to present this paper at a few places in the world. Last was at Imperial Business School in London and at Oxford. And I made the point of saying this, that every slide you are going to see in my presentation today, I presented in China, right? And I say that because for those of you who have presented a paper in China, you will know that you have to send your PowerPoint slides ahead of time. Yeah, and they will be vetted, yeah, and then you will present them. So when I sent this slide deck in, I actually thought that a lot of slides may go missing, and you'll anticipate why when I get into the presentation. But only one slide. There was only one slide that there was an issue with. So try to think, yeah, just to keep this a bit more entertaining, which slide you think was the slide that was questioned, yeah, when I did these two presentations in China. But I was super happy to present in China because it's very nice, of course, after my co-author had done with students several years of research on the ground, and we've presented in many places in the world. I have an upcoming presentation in the US, which will be interesting at Harvard on this paper as well. The US reaction should be very interesting. But of course, you want to hear on the ground what people think of it, right? What do they think about what we're saying? And I'll get into that in the Q&A if any of you are curious. But I'll start now with the paper, and I'll start with the first line. Yeah, it's always a good place to start. And the first line goes like this: China is known in the West for many things. However, a rules-based market for shareholder activism is not one of them. Now, why? Why do we say that a rules-based market for shareholder activism is not something that China is known for in the West? Of course, when you think of China and you think of the West, you read a lot, right? If you pick up The Economist, the Financial Times, the New York Times, President Xi Jinping, right, is infamous in the West for demanding, and this is a quote, right, from the Financial Times, that businesses conform to the aims of the Communist Party. this is actually a picture from the Financial Times. Yeah. And why did they put this picture? This picture was a picture underneath it. There was a story about the new head of the CSRC, which is like the SEC, the financial regulator in China. And the story was about how he had been given the sobriquet broker butcher, because he was in charge of a crackdown on stockbrokers about a decade earlier. And this is the new head of the financial regulator in China. So you have Xi Jinping, who is seen to increasingly, especially during COVID, right, seen and reported to increasingly be tightening his grip on companies. You have a new head of the CSRC, who's known by the name broker butcher. And then, of course, you have billionaires reportedly disappearing all the time. I always find this interesting. For the last, I think, 9 years now, I've had the pleasure of teaching a course at Tokyo University. And it's like a running joke I have when I go to Tokyo University. I say, when am I going to see Jack Ma? Because Jack Ma is actually on the faculty list at Tokyo University. He gained an appointment when he disappeared, although I never saw him there. And there's an interesting backstory as to maybe why he got this appointment or how he got this appointment. But in any event, of course, Jack Ma disappeared and then he reappeared. Yeah. And nobody really knows what he was doing in between. But I don't know. I don't think I would want to go where he went, but maybe I do. But it was curious, right? It was reported widely, and not just Jack Ma, but many other billionaires. So when you put all of this together, right, you put the crackdown of Xi Jinping, you put the broker butcher, you put billionaires disappearing, again, this isn't the kind of environment that you would expect to have a vibrant, rules-based market for shareholder activism. We got very interested in this research because of what the literature did not say. There's a huge literature, as I'm sure many of you are aware, on shareholder activism. Shareholder activism has been an active space. But if you look up the literature on shareholder activism in China, in mainland China, there's almost nothing. The few sources we could find basically said that there's either no cases or very few cases. It's not just in English. My two co-authors also searched in Chinese. And there was also not any large report of significant activity in the space of shareholder activism in Chinese either. And this really is a curious fact. So we start at the start of the paper, right? We look at what is said about shareholder activism in China, and in fact, it's the opposite, right, of activism. What is suggested, Nico Hausen, who's an excellent China law scholar at Michigan Law School, described in a paper in 2015 that minority shareholders and SOEs are passive and politically disempowered. Even if shareholders exercise their legal rights, government officials may simply refuse to acknowledge them due to political considerations. Now, you may say that's a long time ago, that's 2015. But there's a 2022, actually an excellent rising star scholar, Chang from NUS in Singapore. She finished her PhD, and she actually did most of her PhD on this topic. And what she concluded in a 2022 paper is that private institutional investors as minority shareholders are likely to remain passive in state-owned enterprises due to political pressure and other reasons. So the story is quite clear. There's not a lot of activism. When there are minority shareholders, those minority shareholders are passive and politically disempowered. We did ask the question of why, and if you looked at our paper, you'll realize, if you haven't already by now, that we found a lot of cases of shareholder activism, okay? And when we started uncovering more and more of these cases, we sort of asked, why has this not been reported? And of course, we can only pontificate about this. We can't prove anything. But if you're familiar with the literature on Chinese corporate governance, and there is some excellent work on Chinese corporate governance. So one of the great scholars outside of China is a scholar by the name of Curtis Millhop. He's a good friend of mine, and we're working on a paper together right now. He's written a lot on Chinese Communist Party boards, okay? So there's a requirement for companies to have a Chinese Communist Party committee as part of their corporate governance structure. This has been studied in a number of papers. There's also a whole stream of literature that looks at the influence that the Chinese Communist Party has, not just over state-owned enterprises where they're the controlling shareholder, but non-state-owned enterprises. Just to summarize, in the interest of time, very, very quickly, the literature tends to have a laser focus on researching the political power that is exercised in corporate governance in China. And I say this research is good because a lot of it is good and it is true. But in our estimation, I think what our research is showing is that that is one sliver of what is going on. And there's this whole other universe in China, okay, where corporate governance takes place in a rules-based system where the party isn't actively involved on a micro level in what is going on. They leave this to the market, they leave this to the rules that are in place, and it is enforced as you would expect it to be enforced in any other sophisticated market in the world. And why I have this picture up is we say in the paper that if you know the old adage, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And we say, if you only look for politics in China, you'll only find politics. Yeah, and that is, in our estimation, why this was overlooked. So now I get to the data, which is the really exciting part, right? And you'll see that we go back to 2007. Now, why 2007? China underwent something called the split share reform in 2007. I don't have time to talk about it in detail right now. But basically, you can think of this as sort of the start of the free market for tradable shares, right? And you even see in 2007, there's not many cases, but we unearthed a few cases, right? But if you compare 2008, let's not take the low point, but sort of the early high point of 2008, and you compare that to 2023, okay, that's a 900%, ninefold, 9x increase, right? And then, of course, you can't avoid noticing this spike during COVID, right? Where you have an acceleration, basically the last 5 years that we collected data for have 2/3 of the cases. Okay, so you've had a great acceleration in the level of cases. And we were very strict. I can go into the definition we use for activism. Actually, I really have to thank a lot of the early feedback we got from people who were pressing us very hard on this paper. And it made us tighten up our definition to try to get it to conform as closely as we could. I even think we went a bit overboard in being how strict. We could have had more cases, but we thought the point was made and we wanted to be super careful in requiring that, how we define activism, which I'll get into what we mean by activism because we chart it out. But we also require that it's publicly reported. We can verify that the campaign started. There's a traceable record of opposition to management. And here's the type of activism. So I say that this is extraordinary because it is ordinary. Now, what do I mean by this? So actually, the activism in China is not unusual. It's only unusual if you have as a priori understanding of China that it's not rules-based, that it's not based on market incentives, right? But if you were in Australia or Canada or Japan or the United States, right, the things you see up here are not strange, right? Shareholder proposals to nominate a director, okay? So you're talking about a person who doesn't like what's going on in the company, so they try to gather up enough votes to put a representative director on the board. So this is just plain vanilla type of activism, okay? Exercising majority of minority votes, okay? So a lot of things under Chinese corporate law require a majority of minority vote, meaning that the controlling shareholder is not allowed to participate because they're conflicted out, and you need a vote of the minority shareholders, right? And of course, this is an effective way, especially in a controlled company, to exercise your rights because the majority is out of the picture. Again, shareholder proposals come up for other things than just nominating directors. And I was speaking to Elizabeth earlier, and I'll bring up this point later. China is quite extraordinary in the amount of power that it allocates to shareholders, right? So generally, and there's a different allocation all around the world. The US, and when I say the US, I'm referring to Delaware. But you know, if you take, say, Delaware law, although Delaware is in flux right now, I'm actually in the early stages of a paper with a scholar at UPenn named Jill Fish. We're looking at this SB 21. There's a lot going on in Delaware, okay? But typically, okay, in the past, Delaware was a board-centric model, right? So, you know, in the past, staggered boards and poison pills and many things to entrench the directors. So Australians would look at it and say, well, your comparison's no good because maybe it's the US that's the weird one, not everybody else in China. I'll agree with you to a certain extent, okay? But even compared to, say, Canada or Australia or Singapore, in China, the shareholder meeting has an extreme amount of power, meaning if you can get the required number of shareholders together and pass a resolution, the board has to carry it out, okay? So this is made quite clear in Chinese law. Okay, now if you ask ChatGPT, they'll confirm that I'm right, and so we know it's right, yeah? Unless it's hallucinating. But, you know, so in all seriousness, though, you know, this isn't really, if you were just to line up the black letter law, this is quite clear. The question is it enforced, right? And this is really, really what it's about, right? Public campaigns, okay, not that many, but there are some public campaigns. Litigation, far less. We don't go into this in the paper. We sort of have one or two sentences saying probably directors' duties aren't as well worked out in China. It's a whole other research project, but you just don't see a lot of litigation. Tender offers, also very few. Again, this is probably because of the shareholder structure in China, far more concentrated, not like Japan at all, not like the US or the UK, or for that matter, not like Australia, right, where you have far more dispersed companies. And so this is your activism. It's quite straightforward, right? So China's focus on building a regulatory regime. So another interesting thing about China, right, is I think that people have underappreciated how hard the government has worked to build a high quality and robust regime for both institutional investors and shareholders. Now, I have an entirely separate paper that was published in the Columbia Journal of Asian Law. I should say this paper will be out next month in the Harvard Business Law Review. With Lin Lin, a dear friend at the National University of Singapore. And we traced the rise of institutional investors in China. And you won't see this chart in this paper because it's in our other paper, but it's in the footnotes, this paper. So it's the rise of institutional investors. Why we found this curious and felt like a paper needed, actually, this is how I came across this second paper. So when I was doing the paper on institutional investors in China, you'll see that there's a small section in on activism. So we found a few of these activist cases. Then we thought, oh, wow, we have to dig into this. Yeah. But why were we looking at this? Well, if you go back to 2003, there's almost no institutional investors in China. And if you read the literature on China, it's all about SOEs. It's all about state-controlled firms. But the shareholder side is not investigated very much. And what Lin Lin and I found is you go from 0% basically in 2003 to 20% of the market, okay? And if you look at the free float, so tradable shares, it's almost 50% is institutional investors. Why don't you hear about this? Well, I asked the question. BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, what the Americans like to call the big three. What percentage do they own in China? Far less than 1%. Yes. They don't exist. So this is, again, there's a lot of literature. I did a book with Denise Kate-Lazou at King's College on global shareholder stewardship. Okay, there's a lot of literature on institutional investors. Okay, but there's almost nothing on China. Okay, and this is also problematic because there's been this huge rise. Now, why has there been a rise? The Chinese government for 2 decades has been trying to develop a regulatory architecture. They don't want BlackRock calling the shots, but they want a BlackRock, yeah, and now they have it. So they have big, huge institutional investors. These are all Chinese institutional investors, okay, which have now play a major role. Now, of course, in this other paper, we have to break the institutional investors into private ones and state-controlled ones, right? But I'm just raising this point because it's important for you to understand the context that there's a long history in China of creating a regulatory regime to empower institutional investors to create rights for shareholders, okay? And this is actually quite clear, right? Also, as I mentioned, very robust rights for shareholders, okay? In fact, you know, some experts have went as far to say it has one of the most robust shareholder empowering corporate statutes in the world, okay? And this, again, is, you know, I'm very confident in making this statement because it's just black letter law. The question is, how is it enforced, right? But you can be quite systematic by just lining up the provisions in the Chinese Act against other acts in the world, and that's just a fact, right? Again, the shareholders meeting is the supreme authority of the company. I've already talked about that. Very little discretion of directors to exclude votes, especially, of course, votes which are passed on a majority basis have to be carried out. And more importantly, there's a new Companies Act that went into effect. It was passed by in 2023, but it went into effect on July 1st, 2024. And you'll see that the major things that were changed in that act, for instance, the shareholder proposal right used to be 3%. As of July 1st, 2024, it's 1%. There used to be no double derivative action. Now there is a double derivative action. Inspection rights for shareholders were increased greatly, okay? This all very clearly shows that we want to give more rights to small shareholders to be able to voice their views, right? Now, of course, the question then becomes, and this was the big question which the paper, we spent most of our time on this. Collecting the data was a massive task, and then we were quite satisfied that we have these 156 cases. But the big elephant in the room is, who are these activists? And specifically in the Chinese context, are these activists state-owned pension funds, or are they private? And who are the targets? Are the target companies private, or are they state-owned enterprises? And then we had to get into another level of granularity, right? Because not all SOEs are the same, right? Of course, you have very powerful SOEs. You take Costco, the shipping company. Why is it powerful? It's a federal, a national SOE, okay, with huge political significance. Okay, it's the largest dry bulk shipper in the whole world. It's also been put on the sanction list by the US because it varies things between China and Iran. Okay, so this is a hugely important geopolitical company where the government is a controlling shareholder. That is different than an SOE at a municipal or provincial level. Of course, those SOEs still have some political power, but they are not nearly as powerful as these so-called, if you want to use a term that Curtis Millhap sort of coined a bit, national champions, right? These are the federal ones, right? And then on the other side, it's what Lin and I uncovered in our paper, right? You have to divide the activist into different categories, the private one, and then the provincial one, and then the national one. Okay, so essentially you have a 3x3, right? 9 possibilities matching up, right? In terms of who the activist is going to be and who the target is going to be, right? And the question is, does the Chinese Communist Party always win? Just to put it very simply, right? The intuition prior to our research would be that you launch a campaign against a national champion and you're a private firm, you lose. You're a national champion shareholder, you launch it against a private party, they win. And that's the intuition. And that's what we wanted to test. What did we find? And I'll show you, we ran a proper regression analysis, not me. If I ran the regression, it would be no good, yeah. But somebody who's good at this, way ran the regression, yeah. I have to be honest about these things. So the regression, you'll see, and I'll put it up on the screen. Okay, I did take a 5-day crash course at USC 10 years ago on, it was like empirical studies for dummy lawyers, I think. It's run by Lee Epstein. It's a great course, but it didn't make me an expert overnight. So you know, whether the target is a POE or SOE has no statistically significant effect on the success rate. In fact, just the descriptive statistics, I think, are quite striking, right? 78% of activist campaigns against national champions were brought by private companies, and 57% of those succeeded. Okay, so you have a significant amount of campaigns being brought by private shareholders against national champions, more than a majority win, okay? And we found this quite fascinating, but of course you want to test this empirically to see if we have statistically significant results. Then if you turn over the coin, right, I think it's even more interesting that an activist status as a state activist shareholder and a private activist shareholder, okay, we found that state-controlled activist investors very often, right, 50% of activist campaigns launched by the national champion investor, okay, failed when the target was a private firm. Now, what was very interesting, and this is more my wheelhouse than the empirical stuff, okay? Although I find the empirical stuff sort of fun, as long as Wei's doing it. Yeah. But for me, I like the case studies. Yeah. So for each one of these 156 cases, we went into the details as far as we could to gather, you know, what happened. And a few of these cases, which is the back end of our paper, are absolutely fascinating. Okay. And some of the most fascinating cases are these cases where you have a state activist shareholder. Okay, so somebody representing, say, a provincial pension fund. And they show up at a private company. And they want to do something as mundane as elect their representative directors to the board. And they walk into the meeting expecting to vote. And they're told, and I'm summarizing here for time, and I'm Canadian, yeah, so I apologize. But they say, get the hell out of here. Why? Because you haven't filled out your form right, yeah? So it's quite shocking. Then what do you expect? So what did I expect? Again, I put all my cards on the table, yeah? I expected them to end up where Jack Ma is, wherever that was. Yeah, but that's not what happened. What happened? The government official leaves the meeting. And in one case, complains to the provincial securities regulator. What does the securities regulator do? They write a letter to the company. They say, you're not following the company law. You need to let these people vote for the director. What does the company do? They say, go to hell. We're not letting the person in. Now, as somebody who has been in Singapore for 2 decades, and I think of Temasek, right? If a representative shows up from Temasek and wants to go into the annual general meeting that they've invested in, I doubt that this would be the response that they would receive. Yeah. So this is quite bold. Now, of course, there's another research project here. What is the power balance? Who is this person? Okay, where are they coming from? Is this a billionaire who's linked to maybe the party in a more substantial way than some provincial level poor province? I don't know. Okay, but in any event, right? There's a lot of ways that maybe you could explain this, but it is shocking. Okay, then the regulator writes back. They say, no, we don't care. Then what do? They take them to court, and what happens in court? They win. Then the party appeals, and they win on appeal. The government. Now, again, this is extraordinary because it is ordinary. This is exactly what you would expect to find in Australia or Canada. I was going to say the United States because I'm going to the United States, so I really love it, yeah. And, you know, it's interesting, right? Because this is what you would expect to find in a place that you have rule of law and, you know, the regulator is constrained and they go to court and this is how it works, yeah? So there's nothing, in that respect, there's nothing unusual about it in the sense that controlling shareholders always try to maintain their power and sometimes lawyers will rely on technicalities, right? And if they do so, but it's against the spirit of the law or even the letter of the law, then you have your day in court, right? And so this seems to be exactly what happened here. And then we uncovered this, yeah, and I really love this part of the paper. It's going to be a separate paper on this. Actually, when Jill Fish from UPenn, she was in Singapore, and she has probably the best article in the US on the GameStop episode. For those of you who haven't seen GameStop, or you haven't read about it, you can just watch Dumb Money on Netflix. Yeah, it will explain the whole thing to you. But basically, GameStop was a story during the COVID time of basically university students and mainly blue-collar people using an app, okay, called Robinhood, and they got together and they conducted what is called a short squeeze. And it's basically the story of David and Goliath where the small people beat Wall Street, okay, to put it very simply. And the whole idea, there's a lot of interesting things to think about with GameStop, you know, the role of technology in sort of making activists out of the regular person, right, where collective action problems in the past would have prevented this. But we found the Chinese, well, that his name was Roaring Kitty, among other names which I dare not speak, yes. But we found the Chinese Roaring Kitty that goes by the name Legend of the Red Scarf. I kid you not, on a platform called Snowball. And what happened in this case was Legend of the Red Scarf went on Snowball. You can think of it in the English world as Reddit, and gathered, started complaining against who? Costco, the big shipping company I mentioned earlier, that's a state-owned enterprise. Why were they complaining? Because Costco hadn't paid out a dividend for over a decade and is sitting on a pile of cash. And the people are not happy in China because share prices have sucked, right? And haven't been very good. Yeah, so the market hasn't been doing well. And if you invest in the S&P 500, you realize that everybody's getting rich. You're not getting rich. There's a property crisis. People are upset. Yeah. And so people are complaining online. They gather up the proxies, enough to get to your 3%. In fact, far more. And what happened? Costco caved. They pay out the dividend. Okay, why is this an interesting case? Very interesting on many levels. Okay, we hear about the great Chinese firewall. Yeah, I experienced this because I used to be very good with my VPN. Yeah, now my VPN is no good anymore. I pay a 1-year subscription, doesn't work. Yeah, so I'm upset. Yeah, so the Chinese firewall is very good. Yeah, another fact about me that makes the internet very personal for me in China. Yeah, this is a personal grievance. So I am from a relatively unknown place in Canada, was where I was born. It's called Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Winnipeg is a very sort of, I love the city. I go back every summer, yeah, but it's a working class place, yeah. It's not famous for much. Yeah, we've had some good ice hockey players. There's one thing about Winnipeg that is super famous. Like everybody in this room will know, but only one thing, yeah? And it's Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh comes from Winnipeg. Winnie is Winnipeg, yeah? Winnie the Pooh. Now, why do I bring this up in the context of the internet? Well, as many of you may know, Winnie the Pooh, if you try to find Winnie the Pooh images in China, good luck. Why? Because Winnie the Pooh was used as a way to make fun of Xi Jinping. So now the censors have blocked my hometown, only thing make me famous, Winnie the Pooh is blocked in China. So I know from personal experience, if the Chinese government wants to get rid of something on the internet, they can do this quite effectively. Why is that interesting? Well, with Legend of the Red Scarf, if they wanted to shut this down, they could. Okay, the question is, why didn't they shut this down? Well, if you go back to 2006, okay, much earlier, China has been putting in regulations, and then they increased them in 2015, they increased them 2 years ago, about paying out dividends. You look at Japan. Japanese companies have built moats of cash, yeah, and they're sitting on all of this. Japan's had originally a lost decade, and then it's 2 decades, and on, yeah. The Chinese government is cognizant of this. They don't want companies sitting on cash because it's not good, okay, so they want them to pay out dividends. So I don't want you to confuse many Western readers when they read our paper. They say, oh, this is activism. So this is activism like social activism, like I heard you had in Melbourne a few days ago, yeah? So you know, this type of, this is a different breed, yeah? This is shareholder activism for the purpose of improving corporate governance, to increase corporate profits, to make companies more efficient, yeah? This is what the Chinese Communist Party wants, because they want more BYDs. This is not activism in the sense of social activism, right? I should say we looked through our 156 cases. There's not one about ESG, not one. Yeah, so these are pure economic plays. Yeah, so that is another very interesting point. Another interesting point, and I talked to somebody at the Wall Street Journal just less than a week ago about this. Why hasn't The Economist or the Wall Street Journal run a story on this? The Economist ran a story on some things that I did with a researcher, Gengoto, at Tokyo University on activism in Asia. They were very happy to run this. Again, I don't want to be a conspiracy theory person, but I just find this was reported all over China. If you talk to somebody, Legend of Red Scarf in Chinese, this was reported in national media. It has not been reported in English. Hopefully it will be soon, but this is counter narrative of China, right? This is online campaign succeeding in a big national champion. I hope The Economist would run it. I hope the Wall Street Journal runs it, New York Times, but it's curious. Yeah, that's all I have to say. We found another very interesting effect, and this is, again, another research project that has to be done. So sometimes the activist is a provincial shareholder activist, and the target is from another province. So I find this very fascinating. So I just put this map of China, yeah, and I just put this up. I found it on the internet, yeah, that you'll see these in various forms. It's just to show you the size of China, right? So the maps represent roughly the populations of each province, right? So you have, you know, a province that's equivalent to Japan, yeah, in population. So you just need to get in your head, right? The regulatory complexity of China is just enormous. When you're talking about all of these pension funds in these countries, right? In this province, the pension fund is dealing with as many people as Japan in the one province, right? And then you have municipal ones. So you can imagine the complexity. So this also sort of runs against this idea that you have the Chinese Communist Party on a national level controlling everything, micromanaging it down to the municipal level. What actually we found is one province is launching a campaign against another province. If they wanted to solve this behind closed doors, they could, okay? But they don't want it. They want to promote this competition between the provinces. Sometimes we found 2 provinces launching concurrent campaigns against a single target and dueling with each other to get control, okay? Why? Because if they do better, they get incentivized, right? And so this makes sense, but this sort of state-on-state activism is a whole other project that we hope to get underway, right? Which I think is a critically important feature, because a lot of the things that are written about China, at least in English and in Chinese in the corporate governance space, from what I understand from my co-authors, don't go into this level of granularity, right? They treat it as if we have state-owned enterprises, okay, and it's just this national level, and they all are beating to one drum. Yeah, but I think it is far more complicated than that, at least from our research, right? Further evidence that it's rules-based. So what would you expect to find in a free market sort of rules-based system? So I'll show you our statistical results in a second. But the one thing where we had the strongest statistically significant, robust result is that activists that own more shares, okay, so they have a larger toehold in the company, have a much better chance of succeeding in a campaign. Again, it's a very boring result, right? This isn't going to win us any awards in some business school if it's any other country, because that is obvious. You will find this result everywhere, okay? We also have found that the ROA, okay, but not on a statistically significant basis, but it was very close, and Wei is like the strictest empiricist ever. Yeah, we added 2 cases, and then we dropped several great statistically significant results, and they were borderline cases, and Wei's like, we have to include them, they're in the definition, yeah? But it was very close to statistical significance. Was ROA, okay, which is basically profitability of companies, is higher. It's less likely the chance the campaign's going to succeed. ROA is lower, meaning the company's not as successful. Campaigns are more likely to succeed. Okay, all of these are what you would expect in a rules-based system. Also, 2018, right? We find some important changes. Okay, so I worked a lot on global shareholder stewardship, right? And China stands out from Singapore, Japan, Korea, in that it doesn't have a separate stewardship code. Also, Australia has a few of them, right? But they did amend their corporate governance code in 2018, again, with the intent to make shareholders more active, okay? And this was right at the time when we see a spike in the activity that we saw. So in terms of statistically significant results, okay, so here is our regression on the political factors coding the various companies for their political connectedness, as I explained. And this is the percentage of shareholding that I explained, right? Very robust results for that, right? I want to make another point very clear. And how much time do I have? I don't want to go too long. 10 minutes? Okay, I'll wrap up in 2 minutes and then we can discuss this. So I just want to say that we're not saying that politics doesn't play any role. We did find a very significant result, which is a non-result. So if you look at this is success rate, you'll see the highest success rate was actually private against central SOE. Lowest success rate was central shareholder against local SOE. But the one place we found no cases, so we couldn't test it in our empirical analysis, is there was not a single case of a provincial level SOE, shareholder activist, ever launching a campaign against a national champion. It doesn't exist. Why is that important? It's important because it probably shows us there's still some sort of hierarchy, where if you're a provincial level shareholder, you dare not launch the campaign, and these probably are settled behind closed doors. But of course, it doesn't feed into our empirical results because no cases simply don't exist. So I end with this, and this was a line that my co-authors told me not to put in the paper because they thought it would bar us from any good journal. But maybe this is the one time I prove them a bit wrong. And we say this, right? There's a reason why the USSR regularly had shortages of toilet paper and why it did not have shareholder activism. China has an abundance of both. And what the point we are making, quite obviously, is that the USSR, and I've taught at Moscow State University, I was a very junior lawyer on the Yukos case with Khodorkovsky. it is interesting that you see in China, right, these amazing companies, BYD, 5-minute charge, right? DJ, the drone maker, best drone maker in the world, solar panels. If you are a true believer in free markets, I think you should embrace what we found, which is saying that this isn't the Chinese Communist Party micromanaging every annual general meeting and you produce these amazing products. Rather, there's a large bubble that has been created where actually the governance is rules-based on a market basis. In the end, this is not saying that the Communist Party is weak, it's saying they're very strong because they sit on top of all of this and control it. And if it goes well, they do well. If it goes poorly, they do poorly. And what are we going to see in the future? I think we're only going to see more activism because this new code came out, which makes it much easier for shareholders. So I'll leave it to your imagination what slide was into question because I'm out of time. But if anybody wants to ask that question, I can reveal it. But with that, at least we'll have a few minutes for discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, look, thank you so much for a truly fascinating presentation and for blowing off the lid on an area which was previously unexplored. It was a great privilege to hear such original research and discover something so surprising about Chinese corporate governance. Thank you also for wrapping up quickly to leave time for questions. I hope that we'll also hear some from people who are online. At the moment, we don't have any online questions, but if you have one and you're listening remotely, please just put it in the Q&A and I can see them coming through as they do. But Kamal, are there questions in the room? Yeah.
And I was just wondering about your empirical case collection. I'm guessing that you identified cases from a combination of media and maybe reported law decisions. Would that be correct?
That is correct for the end part of our analysis. So the starting point, and so we have a section in our paper that talks about the strategy we had for collection. And actually the starting point was to start with a database where 5% shareholders, so they're similar to sort of 13D in the United States, where a shareholder over 5% has to declare it and then has to declare what they are doing, right? Why they're accumulating this percentage. Unfortunately, for reasons that we explain in the paper, this was used as a procedural workaround for setting the agenda for shareholders meetings, which yielded us over 9,000 cases. So that was our wide net. Then we had to get a group of RAs under the supervision of Zhou Chan, my co-author, to go through that. Then when we found cases that didn't look like they were just dealing with this meeting agenda issue, which was just a side point, then we looked up to verify them either in reported decisions or in news reports. And then we gathered as much information on those cases as we could to determine. So success is a very difficult thing to measure because let's say you're an activist and you want to put somebody on the board. If you put them on the board, we code that as success, right? Of course, the next day they could be kicked off the board. But this is what the literature does as standard practice. Now, why does it do that? Because if you don't code that way, you can never code. Because you say, okay, well, wait 1 month or 2 months or 5 months or whatever. And then there's all the different procedures, right? So that things that can count as activism. So yeah, that's generally how we collected. And then, but we did, I should say, even if we coded it as a success, we then kept gathering information to see if there was functional success. And that's why we have the case studies at the end, because there was, in particular, one case we found, which was quite prominent, where the shareholders succeeded according to our coding, but then their votes were essentially disregarded what they actually succeeded on. And so we write about that case because it was an outlier, but we didn't just stop with the coding.
Questions in the room?
So I've got a couple of questions, but so I was just thinking about, and I might have missed this. So the rights that shareholders have in China. So obviously that's not the be all and end all in terms of how much activism there is, but do they have? Oh, it's probably too simplistic a question, but I'm just wondering what sort of rights they have in terms of proposing motions or compared to sort of perhaps Singapore or Australia or.
Right. So the rights, I guess, are fairly robust. Okay, I don't know the exact percentage in Australia you're required to have to make a shareholder proposal. Okay, but in most jurisdictions, you need either a significant number of shares or a certain percentage of shares. Okay, yeah. So China's 3. Okay, many places are 5. They just lowered it to 1. Okay, so just as a comparative benchmark. And then most places have quite a strict division of powers. Okay? So in Singapore, going back now, so there's a section which was put into the Singapore Companies Act to solidify that the board has general management control over the company, because it was unclear in the case. Well, now it's crystal clear, meaning that except in extraordinary circumstances, shareholders cannot get together on a management decision and overrule the board. Okay, that can be done in China. Okay. On, say, a strategic business decision. That could not be done in Singapore. Okay, because that would be seen to be within, in the division of powers, the board's sole jurisdiction. Now, of course, in Singapore, like in Australia, you can remove the board. Okay. Again, Singapore and Australia, why I said the US is an outlier is because, for instance, Delaware allows for staggered votes, where you can only remove 1/3 of the directors on any given election if you have a staggered board in place, right? That is not allowed in Australia. It's not allowed in Singapore, right? It's not allowed in the UK, right? So this would be one example of that. Also, if you go down the list of things in China where you need to have a majority of the minority vote, the list is a lot longer than in Singapore or in the UK. Okay, I imagine probably also in Australia. So this, again, allocates more authority to minority shareholders. Also, all listed companies that have a controlling shareholder must have cumulative voting. That is not that common in most places in the world, right? Cumulative voting, of course, is optional under most companies' acts. There are some that make it mandatory. But of course, cumulative voting gives an enormous power to minority shareholders, right? Because this allows them, in most jurisdictions, it's majority voting, which means that if you have 51%, you get the vote to work, right? But if you have cumulative voting, it means that essentially if you own 10%, you get 10% of the directors if you pool all of your votes by the same person. So all of these things are quite strong rights that if you look at something like the OECD does a very good job. Every 2 years they issue a handbook on corporate governance. And if you were to go to the handbook section, all the things I mentioned, these do exist. I'm not trying to say that China is the only country in the world that does this, but they're clearly on the long end of the tail of providing minority shareholders with more powers to install directors as minorities, to veto, to make business decisions that must be executed by the directors. And I would say that Delaware is on the other tail. And I would say Singapore, the UK, Australia, probably somewhere in between. Yeah, maybe a bit closer to the shareholder rights than Delaware, but somewhere in between.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, but can I just ask you one quick follow-up question? Because given what you've described of the very extensive shareholder rights in China, I think I heard you say during your presentation that none of the activist steps that you examined concerned ESG. And I just wondered, do you have a hypothesis about why that might be?
Yeah, so my first reaction, and I'll probably be wrong, but I'll say it anyways, is that most people buy shares to make money. And they're angry because the stock market hasn't done well. And that is the only time they feel it's worth their while to spend time and money on lawyers to complain. That, I think, is just the reality. China has the most retail investors in the world. It's difficult to measure, but people say between 150 to 200 million shareholders, which is much more than the population of all of Japan, right? These are retail investors. So these people buy shares to make money. There is a very interesting question that you've embedded in your question, I think, which is how is ESG being carried out in China? It's fascinating, right? China's moving forward very quickly. Okay, why? Again, in my estimation, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't do themselves any favors. If the rivers are dirty, air is polluted, again, this is not going to strengthen their long-term viability. And if you look at the US government, they used to try to embarrass China, especially around the Olympics, by installing an air monitor inside the US embassy to take the readings of the air in Beijing. They called them blue sky days. Yeah? And actually, when I was presenting another paper at Cambridge, somebody asked a question and they said, oh, this is all fine and well, but have you ever breathed the air in Beijing? I took a gamble, was quite a prominent corporate law person, and my response back was, when were you in Beijing last? And he said, 15 years ago. I said, go back. He's not perfect, but then I sent him a picture. I was for the 10th, it was unfair. I didn't tell him, but it was the 10th anniversary of Belton Road. So you can imagine that the air was extra clean that day. I was in Tiananmen Square. Honest to God, the sky was like blue, like somebody had painted it. Yeah, I took a picture of myself. I sent it to him. Come visit. So ESG is taken very seriously. The lever for ESG, for whatever reason, is seen as a top-down regulatory measure. Okay, and they haven't really relied on shareholders. Shareholders are seen as economic engines to create efficiency, to create the next UID or DeepSeek or whatever. It's not to save the planet. But of course, if you can have a company that's making money and can make the best solar panels or the best BYDs, maybe that will come.
Well, look, we could keep talking all night, but I should wind it up. We have gone a little over, but we did start late. Thank you so much for a really stimulating presentation. Please join me in thanking Professor.